Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me is David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
This Sunday, we have a special guest, Jeremy Appel, up from Alberta. He's a co-host of two podcasts, The Forgotten Corner and Big Shiny Takes, and also the proprietor of The Orchard Substack. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Matt. I mean, this is really the Canadian dream, getting noticed by Americans. That's all we aspire.
You know, I'm happy to notice Alberta. I'll be honest. You know, as a North Dakotan, I've been to British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. I've never been to Alberta, but also I will say, I never knew that bigger cities than Bismarck existed in the territories north of North Dakota. I assumed it was just wasteland until like late in high school. I'm like, oh, Winnipeg, and these towns actually have like much bigger than the Dakota. So it took me a while to notice Canada, but now, you know, love Canada. So Jeremy, thank you so much once again. There's been elections in Alberta. Before we get into some of like the wider and deeper issues, can you just give folks an overview of these elections?
Yes. So the most recent election was between the United Conservative Party, which is, I mean, essentially the Republican Party in Alberta, and the New Democratic Party, which is a party with social democratic roots. It was founded in the 60s as a merger between the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which is like this agrarian socialist party that actually in neighboring Saskatchewan formed government in the 60s and was the first province to implement, I guess what you call Medicare for all, we just call Medicare. And they merged with the Canadian Labour Congress to sort of create this social democratic party. But as we'll discuss, it sort of very much veered from that tradition. So the UCP leader is Danielle Smith, who's sort of this talk radio host and newspaper columnist that really got into the COVID conspiracies. She actually quit her job at Global News, a major Canadian broadcaster that hosted her radio show, citing like cancel culture and all. She did the Barry Weiss self-cancel.
She wasn't fired, but it was going to happen, so I'm preempting the firing by what?
Yeah.
Right.
And that's because they made her apologize and delete a tweet early in the pandemic where she said hydroxychloroquine is 100% cure for COVID. She also said drinking tonic water prevents COVID, which she didn't have to delete and apologize for. And I mean, later on,
Jeremy, sorry, I have to cut. We're getting a little bit of an interference on your mic. You just want to refresh the page, and hopefully, I think that might go away, and we can pick that up there. Sorry to cut you off, but it was just a little bit loud. Okay. So sorry to interrupt, Jeremy. So you're talking about Danielle.
Yeah. So obviously, when she quit her mainstream radio job, started a newsletter, as one does, where she talked about crypto and COVID and, all these really like right-wing, like culture war touchstones. And she actually got vaccinated because she was also working as a corporate lobbyist. So she had to be vaccinated, but she actually went down to the States to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because she said she doesn't trust the mRNA. And so that is Danielle Smith. Rachel Notley, the leader of the NDP, was previously premier from 2015 to 2019. First time the NDP formed government in Alberta, which had been governed by varying shades of conservative parties since, like World War II era. And what happened was, my screen is frozen, but you guys can see.
You're still coming through. Yep.
Okay, great. What happened was there's a split in the conservative movement in Alberta between the long governing progressive conservatives and the Wild Rose Party, which was kind of like a almost like Tea Party insurgency type thing, which Smith used to lead. before she lost an election and left politics temporarily, to make a long story short. And this allowed the NDP to sort of come up through the middle and form government for the first time. Then Jason Kenney, who was a federal minister in the government of Stephen Harper, he was sort of like a very like prototypical like neocon type figure, but he came back to Alberta to merge the Wildrose and PC parties to create this united Conservative Party. Notley's government got unpopular pretty quick. There was I mean, one thing that they did that was undeniably a step forward was they brought Alberta's labor laws, which had been so far behind other provinces, sort of a bit more up to speed. They introduced, card check for union certification, but they also tried to sort of impose labor laws on farms. And that became a very contentious issue from these sort of rural small business tyrants who that became like a big flashpoint. But anyways, long story short, Kenney, who is very much like an Ottawa elite, he represented a riding in Calgary when he was in the Harper government, but he spent most of his time in Ontario, sort of. He was the Conservative Party's sort of point man for finding these sort of reactionary elements in immigrant and other cultural communities and sort of bringing them into the Conservative fold. So he comes back to Alberta, slaps on a cowboy hat, rides across the province in this big blue pickup truck, and talks about how the NDP is this socialist menace that is destroying Alberta, and that they're in this unholy alliance with the Trudeau Liberals to destroy the oil and gas industry. And he successfully merged these parties together. I mean, this was around the time of Trump, so in Brexit. So there was definitely this right-wing populist spirit in the air, if you will. And he sort of rode that wave. They won a decisive victory against the NDP in 2019. And there's this sort of perception, even in the rest of Canada, that the Conservatives are like the pro-oil and gas party and the NDP are more environmentalist. But that's not true. I mean, the NDP were just as pro-oil and gas. I mean, their whole selling point was we got Trudeau to agree to build this pipeline, this pipeline expansion to the coast of BC that is opening in early 2024. And it's going to triple the capacity to export tar sands oil, which, Alberta is the third largest oil reserves in the world. Canada does, but most of that's in Alberta. But it's not, it's a very, and I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with the tar sands. It's a very dirty type of oil, right? It's very sticky, and it takes a lot of energy to get it out of the ground compared with other forms of oil. And that's made it a target of international environmentalists. And Kenney sort of painted this picture of there being this vast foreign environmentalist conspiracy to pin Alberta down, that the NDP and the federal Liberals are in cahoots with. And so the NDP did talk about the environment. They imposed a cap on emissions from the tar sands, but the cap was so much higher than emissions already were. It didn't really do anything. They brought in a carbon tax, which Trudeau is doing federally as well. But their entire goal was to get the oil and gas industry to support these policies, which they did temporarily. But within a year or two, all the CEOs that went up on stage with Notley and Indigenous leaders and some environmentalists to announce this sort of compromise climate change plan they got were turfed by their companies, and they all got on board with Kenny and the UCP.
And so that state of affairs sounds exactly like what talk of Green New Deal, just transition is meant to forestall. So the groundwork has not been laid for just transition in Alberta, is what you're saying?
Not in the slightest. In fact, Trudeau announced just transition legislation that still hasn't come to fruition in January. And, it's sort of the devil will definitely be in the details, but the idea of it is to transition people from jobs in the oil and gas industry into jobs in renewable energy. And Notley came out and said it needs to be scrapped. This is bad for Alberta. It's bad for jobs, and that they need to go to the drawing board. And she was asked by a reporter, like, what are you telling your environmental base here? Like, do you think it's going to alienate them? And she was just clueless. She was just like, well, I don't know. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Tough to say. But that sort of presaged their election strategy of just trying to, very similar to the Democrats, right, in the United States, of just trying to flip like sort of soft conservative voters in the suburbs to try and form government. And as we've seen, that was a failure.
Well, right. Well, this is just like when Democrats like basically reiterate every Republican attack on how they let crime run wild, and then are surprised that it hurts them in the elections.
Yeah, and the NDP did that too. I mean, in the downtowns of the two major cities in Alberta, Calgary and Edmonton, there is a major issue of crime and disorder. And so the UCP's policy was to hire 50 new police officers in Edmonton, 50 in Calgary, to like station them downtown and crack some skulls. That wasn't the words Danielle Smith used, but I mean, that was the effect of it. And so the NDP's alternative was, we're going to hire 150 new officers. We're going to hire even more new officers, but we're going to partner them with social workers to, sort of, I guess, further the integration of social work into the carceral system.
Right. I mean, I really want to focus a little bit more on this like tailing strategy from the NDP. But before we get there, just since we were talking about the oil industry a second ago, like, I'd be curious to hear your kind of general like state of play. Cause like, being in Texas, like one, it's like completely controlled by the Republican Party. The Democratic Party really isn't very interested in just transition for the most part, but like there are like these kind of rumblings within like labor here, right? They endorsed a kind of version. The Texas AFL-CIO endorsed a kind of version of just transition, and a point that I make a lot to folks is that I reckon it was probably similar in Canada in their oil industry when the price of oil plummeted during the COVID pandemic. What happened? Workers got squeezed like crazy. People lost their jobs, unions were under attack, etc. And like that's a real frightening experience for like workers in that industry, which like the right can sort of use to say like, look, this is why we have to protect this industry, this is why we have to support it. But like the left or the socialist argument would be, this is why we need to be fighting for workers, not for the companies, because the companies were just sitting on gas. And then when the price skyrocketed too, right, they weren't producing very much either, right? Like the point is like, the left and liberals are so horrible at making this distinction between oil and gas workers and the oil industry.
Right. And the NDP, every step of the way, when they were in power and after, fed this misconception that the oil and gas industry, the interests of these companies is connected to the interests of the workers who work there. And so there was no willingness to pursue this transition in a way that would upset these oil and gas companies. Because I mean, in Canada, all the oil and gas companies are like, yeah, we're committed to net zero by 2050. But they have no plans to do that. And meanwhile, they're just using it to extract more subsidies from the government to invest in like carbon capture in storage, which I'm sure you and your listeners know is a scam. And meanwhile, I mean, they're still laying people off. I mean, oil prices are, fetched record highs because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there were no jobs that resulted from that because these profits are being invested by the oil and gas companies into automation. So to actually eliminate jobs. I mean, just yesterday, Suncor announced, big oil and gas company based in Calgary, that they're laying off 1,500 more workers. And what's the solution to that? No one in the mainstream political discussion will even talk about that. But similar to Texas, the Alberta Federation of Labor has sort of outlined a similar sort of just transition policy that still says, oh, we're going to keep extracting oil and gas, but we're going to reduce it and use it for other purposes. And I mean, but I think it's a step in the right direction. But
go ahead.
Sorry, you go ahead.
No, I mean, I just like while we're just on the oil stuff, it's like, because the thing that's difficult with it as like a question is like there's like the reality of the industry and then there's the idea of the industry, right? Like I think most of our listeners and like it's a very brutal industry to work in. There's not a lot of job security. There's also in the industry itself this kind of like self-perception of like, exactly, it's boom or bust, baby. Like we're tough, we stick out, hard times. But there's also this kind of public imagining that's separate from even people who are directly involved in it. Like as a poor kid here, it's like that is like the blue collar dream job, right? It's like if I'm not going to get educated or have an opportunity to go to college, like this is the way that I can get to the middle class. And of course, not the case in reality for most people. But like culturally, it holds such weight over people's minds that it can be sort of hard to break through.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. Again, these jobs pay well. Some of them are unionized, but there's a reason it pays well because it's hard and it's dangerous, and it's bad for your health and it's bad for the planet. Someone needs to come out and make this connection between the increasing precarity, the danger of the work, and the effects on the planet, and no one seems to be willing to do that. And whenever someone does, the NDP either ignores them or outright dismisses it. I mean, Justin Trudeau isn't a climate hero. I mean, the Trans Mountain pipeline I mentioned earlier to the coast of BC, the company behind it, Kinder Morgan, was going to pull out because it wasn't worth it to them. And so the federal government stepped in and bought it to ensure it came to fruition, right? But even the NDP are running to the right of Trudeau on these issues, which, and again, in the NDP is supposed to be the left-wing party, like in theory, like especially if you look at on the federal level where the NDP's never won an election, although they've had sort of arrangements with the Liberals in like a minority government situation, which is sort of comparable to when you have the presidency but don't control Congress, right? They've been able to exert influence, but I sort of explain this to Americans is that the Conservatives are essentially the Republicans. And like sort of blue dog Democrats, I guess you could say. The Liberals are like the Biden party, and NDP are in theory the Bernie party. But if you look at the federal leader, Jagmeet Singh, he's much more, I think, Elizabeth Warren like he's very much like technocratic tweaks within the system, but he's not like transformative, and he doesn't seek to be in the same way that Bernie does. But then in the provinces where the NDP, especially in Western Canada, where the NDP have sort of supplanted the Liberals as the progressive option, they've adopted the neoliberal consensus fully.
So what, like, I mean, what explains some of like the more recent success with these, losses? I mean, was there a significant change in this kind of tailing of the right strategy for the NDP?
Yeah, well, I mean, they went further than they had previously. I mean, they just didn't talk about their record in government from
Mm-hmm.
2015 to 2019, and I mean that record was imperfect, but they did. I mean, they reduced child poverty in half, and they didn't even want to talk about it. I mean, they're chasing after these suburban soft conservative
Yeah.
voters, and they're
The
assuming
Democratic Party, like all the way. You know?
Yeah,
yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah, maybe you can talk about this, and because we have a lot of American listeners who would, love to have a system where we have a third party, like, and like, I'm just curious, like, what would you tell Americans that, on the good and the bad of that? Because, like, to me, it seems like one, like, there's an upside to having one, like, or let me ask it this way: what's like the base of the NDP? Is that where labor unions go, or do they kind of go to both labor and liberal, or NDP and liberals? And then, like, where geographically are they, like, city, or how does this play out?
Yeah, well, so the labor movement is closely connected with the NDP. The Alberta Federation of Labor has 2 seats on the party's board, like reserved for them. Rachel Notley's husband is the spokesperson for the Canadian Union of Public Employees in Alberta, and it's like really gross. He just like simps from her from like QP's like Twitter account. And I mean, again, the NDP is definitely better on labor issues, but it's not perfect. And I suspect most QP members don't think that they're flawless, like Lou Arab does. So federally, I mean, I think a lot of the labor movement, like Unifor, which is the big private sector union in Canada, is very much on the sort of anyone but conservative train. So they advocate for voting for Liberal or New Democrat, depending on which riding you're in and who is better positioned to beat the Conservatives. Because that's the thing I think I want to hammer home to your viewers about having a third party is ultimately there are very few three-way races in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
There are some, but mostly it's just there are two parties that really are in competition, whether in some urban ridings, like in downtown Toronto, it's the Liberals against the NDP. Mostly it's Liberals against Conservatives. In Western Canada, it's NDP versus Conservatives. But on the provincial level, though, is in Western Canada in particular, you've just seen the NDP sort of supplant the Liberals as the milquetoast progressive party, right? Like the Alberta Liberal Party, they couldn't even find someone to lead them. They had an interim leader, and they couldn't find anyone to run for the permanent leadership. So their interim leader was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. And they got, very few votes. They didn't run a full slate of candidates. And because the NDP are even federally, where they're more to the left than they are in the provinces, they are a small L liberal party. There's no real radicalism there. And yeah, I mean, essentially Canada has two Democratic parties, right? And yeah, one is supposed to be more left-wing than the other, but that isn't always the case. Like in the federal election of 2015, when the NDP were actually the official opposition for the first time after the 2011 election, because Liberals brought in Michael Ignatieff, who you may be familiar with. He's like a Harvard professor, big liberal interventionist guy.
Yeah, I think intelligence connections. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I thought he was.
I would not be surprised.
Right.
And he was just disaster for the Liberals. So the NDP actually supplanted them on the federal level for the first time. But then in 2015, the NDP ran, so close to the center that Justin Trudeau was able to outflank them on the left. I mean, the NDP were saying, oh, we need to balance the budget. We're not going to raise income taxes. And, all these things that you actually saw from Notley in this campaign in Alberta. And Trudeau said, well, actually, we're going to increase taxes on the wealthy, and yeah, we're going to run like deficits to some extent. And again, like Justin Trudeau is not a left winger, and very much part of this neoliberal consensus. But I think that shows the perils of third party politics when there isn't a party that is like firmly rooted in principle. It just becomes very similar to what you have in the States.
I mean, it's just like it's something that's frustrating for me within like the socialist and progressive movement in the US is like, obviously like electoral structure like can be an impediment. But there's this kind of fantasy that if the electoral system was changed in this way or that way, then we would have like a workers' party, right? And there's just too many examples around the globe to show that like, no, that's a different kind of project necessarily. I mean, could you talk a little bit about like the NDP, maybe nationally and a little bit more focused on Alberta, like its actual like relationship with the base, being both like party based, but also like for lefties, working class voters in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, they very similar to the Democratic Party. They take them for granted, right? It's like, well, who else are you going to vote for, right? And then when people criticize them from the left, they're ignored. And then when they lose for doing exactly what people on the left warned them against doing, then it's like, this is why we lost, because you're doing purity politics, and you weren't enthusiastic enough in supporting us. And and it's just, there's this interesting contradiction here where on the one hand the left vote is completely insignificant and we can ignore these voters because they're not going to help us win, but also they have to support us, and if they don't and we lose, it's their fault. And only one of those can be true.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes down to like the kind of like shuffling around in Alberta, I mean, is there a sense of a class de-alignment happening with the right at all? Do you think that that's a fair way to think about it, or do you think people are becoming more apathetic?
Well, I was just reading now. There's a decent piece of analysis in the CBC, right, our public broadcaster, about how these conservative voters that the NDP were chasing, I mean, some of them voted NDP, but a lot of them either voted UCP because, yeah, they don't like Smith's like COVID conspiracies and her, I haven't even got into the sort of Alberta separatist
I'd love to talk about
that she's trying to cultivate. But at the end of the day, she was going to cut their taxes, and that's their main priority, right? And I mean, so and a lot of them just stayed home. The ones who are really grossed out by Smith never vote NDP, and so they just stayed home. And now already you're hearing some of these prominent conservatives who said they were supporting the NDP said, "Great job. You gained a lot of votes. It was closer race than it could have been otherwise. But now you need to distance yourselves completely from the federal NDP because it's too left wing." And again, even the federal NDP has very much, especially in recent years, undergone this process of becoming this sort of liberal party that is trying to win at all costs. Right. And they've taken a step back from that a bit since Trudeau won by running to the left of them on some significant issues. But I mean, they're still not a left-wing party like federally. And again, so it seems like they're just going to keep making the same mistakes. And I mean, I think the parallel between Danielle Smith and Trump is important in this context because it was an election the NDP should have been able to win. I mean, this is a person who back in the 2000s, she wrote a column in the Calgary Herald where she was a columnist saying that smoking is actually good for you. Right. I mean, she has a long history. Right. I mean, when she was running for the leadership after Kenny, who I mentioned earlier, got turfed, because of his COVID policies, because he sort of was walking this tightrope between keeping everything going as it is and just, letting the economy work its magic.
Mm-hmm.
And then when hospitals started to get overwhelmed, he reluctantly and kicking and screaming imposed very limited restrictions. And that proved bridge too far for the sort of rural base, where at least for the early part of the pandemic, they weren't all that affected by it. It was more of a big city thing, but that changed later. And Danielle Smith sort of became their champion. And she is an admirer of Ron DeSantis, right? Openly, she's he's my guy. Maybe not so, because she is a libertarian, on LGBTQ issues. She's not horrible herself personally, but of course she has the support of the religious right because her libertarian views are just, they can do their thing, I can do mine, right? Everyone is free to discriminate against others, but I would never personally, right? That type of thing. And during the campaign to succeed Kenny, she had, and I think this is very indicative of her hyper libertarian views, is she was doing a podcast interview with this naturopath, and they're talking about these natural remedies for various ailments, including cancer. And Smith said, well, the thing is, with cancer, until you get to stage 4, all your problems are the product of choices that are completely within your control. And that is that is some hardcore neoliberalism right there, right? And it was the perfect opportunity for a ostensibly progressive party to offer a competing vision. And instead, they were just digging up every awful thing Danielle Smith has said, and there's an endless supply, and just say, very similar to Democrats in 2016, right? Surprised they didn't call her Dangerous Danielle. Maybe they will next time, but because they don't seem to have learned any lessons. But they didn't offer a competing vision to their policies were very, because it was tailor-made to appeal to this imaginary suburban swing voter. They weren't really that different from what the conservatives were offering. Right? I think on taxation, that is a good example, because Smith was saying that we're gonna create a new income tax bracket for people who make under $60,000 a year. That's lower. And we're going to introduce a new law. This is supposed to be her first law that she's going to introduce when the legislature is back, that says that makes it so you have to have a referendum if you want to increase taxes in the future. Which is, that's and that's wild too, because how much money does it cost to run a referendum? How much tax money does it cost, right? And the NDP's response was, oh, well, we're going to freeze your income taxes, we're not going to increase them at all, we're going to eliminate small business taxes entirely, and we're going to raise corporate taxes, but they're still going to be the lowest in Canada. And they emphasize them. They're going to be lower than they are in Doug Ford's Ontario, right? That was their selling point, right? And so there was nothing about how these companies are profiting from the precarity of the Alberta working class, in that we're going to make them pay their fair share. It was just, we're going to increase it a little, but that's so we can balance the budget. And don't worry, it's still going to be the lowest in the country. And and I mean, when you're attacking someone's trustworthiness in their character and in how they're fit to be premier, which is the Canadian equivalent of governor, And then the policies you're offering aren't all that different. I mean,
give me the real thing,
say?
baby. You know what I mean? It's just like, I don't know. I've never understood, like, we're gonna be the watered down version of our opponents, and that's gonna help us win somehow.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing I wanted to emphasize is on housing. Their housing, I mean, Alberta doesn't have rent control. Like other provinces in Canada which do, even under conservative governments, don't have rent control. Like the closest thing is you have to give a tenant 3 months notice to increase their rent by however much you want, and you can only do it once a year. And they brought the NDP brought in to run their campaign a guy who is a executive at Airbnb, who lobbied them. This guy Nate Rotman, who they wouldn't even confirm he was working for them, and he wouldn't confirm he was working for them until like less than an hour before polls closed. He tweeted out, "Wow, it was so great to work on this wonderful campaign." And their housing policy, I mean, in Canada, there's a major housing affordability crisis, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver, but it's spreading elsewhere in the country. And they wouldn't talk about rent control. It was their idea was to create a rent bank for tenants who are at risk of eviction because of unforeseen circumstances, and that money goes to their landlord, so they don't get evicted. And Rachel Notley is a landlord. Like she owns a rental property in Edmonton, and so does their housing critic.
It's dark. I mean, it's just dark stuff.
And yeah, I mean, I can imagine, especially like it's difficult to construct housing. At least as in North Dakota, I imagine, there's similar problems in Alberta, like just where geographically you are. So that's horrible. One thing I do want to ask is, as Danielle Smith tries to enter this term, what are the main headwinds? Like, is it still COVID? Because here Republicans have switched to anti-trans stuff, and even Trump is saying, a lot of people actually liked the mRNA vaccine, even though people in this room didn't. So is COVID policy still like the animating sort of headwind or wind in people's sails, or do you see anything else on the horizon?
Yeah, so it's not COVID, because I mean, the pandemic's not over, but the worst of it is, right? ICUs aren't like overflowing with patients. People aren't dying en masse. But of course, if you're immunocompromised, I mean, you still have to live very cautiously. And we've just thrown these people under the bus because a bunch of people don't want to wear a mask inside. But COVID wasn't an animating issue, and that really helped Smith, right? Because all the COVID conspiracies that she believes, I mean, weren't really relevant. And so I think the pivot in Alberta, I mean, so there were a lot, like Smith herself is like it was actually remarkable. There was a UCP leadership debate when she was running, hosted by this far-right news outlet and this Alberta separatist group. And the moderator and half the candidates pulled out of it because they didn't want to tarnish themselves with this. But Smith, of course, participated. And one of the moderators had this horrible, like, transphobic line of questioning about like trans athletes. And Smith actually said, I have a relative who's non-binary, and I don't think that their personal struggles should be used as like a political football.
Wow.
Which was I found quite extraordinary to come from her. And she's pro-choice. But some of her candidates, again, because she's this freewheeling libertarian, one of her candidates who won compared trans students to shit.
Lord.
She said trans students in school were like getting shit in a batch of cookies. And so Smith distanced herself from her and said she wouldn't be allowed to sit in her caucus didn't say for how long she would be banned, and this person won overwhelmingly because it was like a rural, like deeply conservative riding. So I mean, these culture issues are always, you know, they're definitely, I think they have more resonance in Alberta than they do in the rest of the country, because Alberta is very much Canada's most Americanized province. I would say, especially this culture of like having referendums on all sorts of things. I think that's very American compared to the rest of the country. But I think really in Alberta, it's the attacks on the environmentalist movement that will be the convenient pivot for the right, because in that they can get the NDP to go along for the ride. They don't, right? If they start attacking trans kids and stuff, that allows the NDP to sort of be their champion and give them like a wedge issue. For example, when they were last in power, the NDP passed this law that required all schools that receive government funding. In Alberta, private schools receive some degree of government funding. We also have charter schools, which no other province has, though that may change with Doug Ford in Ontario. And they made it so all schools with public funding have to allow the creation of a gay-straight alliance if the students want it, and they can't notify parents of it, if right. So they can't out kids to their parents. And that sort of became a big culture war issue. I mean, Jason Kenney is a social conservative. You know, there's back when he was a student in San Francisco, he appeared on CNN. I don't know if you've seen that, Chiron, with Jason Kenney, anti-abortion activist, because he got the Women's Law Students Association banned from the University of San Francisco campus for circulating a pro-choice petition. But then once he came to power, he sort of dialed back the sort of social conservative stuff, because it really attacked environmentalists. I think that's the big one. But because it was constantly playing this game of getting the NDP to disavow, you know, the sort of green left that is, you know, attacking Albertans' livelihoods. And they essentially followed along every step of the way. You know, Kenney created this war room, this $30 million a year like propaganda outfit called the Canadian Energy Center that would just, anytime there was like media critical of the tar sands, they would respond in real time. They quickly became like a laughing stock. There was the New York Times published this piece on the tar sands and how no one wants to invest in them anymore. And the Canadian Energy Center wrote this long, like unhinged Twitter thread about how the New York Times is unreliable, that it's been accused of anti-Semitism before, and just some really like out there stuff that they ultimately had to apologize for. They also launched an inquiry into the alleged foreign funding of these environmentalists, and it essentially came back and was like, yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot of foreign funding there. It's mostly coming from Canada. And of course, what was left unsighted is the oil and gas industry in Alberta, foreign funded. But Smith has talked about like sort of reviving that and, you know, going even further. I think another sort of culture war issue that they're going to embrace is the whole free speech on campus discourse, which they already did. There was this racist, this anti-Indigenous professor who got fired from the university in Calgary, not for her views, but for like harassing students allegedly. And she was slated to give this talk at the University of Lethbridge, where there are a lot of Indigenous people. Lethbridge is like right by the biggest First Nations reserve in Canada, and students, you know, shut it down. And through protest, and immediately after that, the advanced education minister said that, you know, this is an outrageous attack on free speech, and we're going to force universities to sort of fill out these free speech report cards every year to track how they're protecting speech. Of course, as it is in the States, it's very much geared towards certain forms of speech and not others. And yeah, I mean, I think those will be the big sort of culture war issues that the UCP really focuses on in lieu of COVID not being seen as a major issue anymore.
All right. Well, congratulations, Charles Murray, on your forthcoming college tour of Canadian universities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Danielle Smith has read the bell curve and may not agree with all of it, but makes some interesting points.
Hey, we got to be able to debate these things ad nauseum for 40 years. So, Jeremy, I'm going to share your Substack here, but anything else you want to share with our audience before we let you go here? You got
well, you can find me on Twitter at Jeremy Appel 1025. I'm going to be there till the ship sinks.
Yeah.
You know, I'm also on Blue Sky. If you have an invite, if you've gotten an invite rather, I don't exactly remember what my handle is, but it's some configuration of my name. So put my name in the bar and you can find me that way. You can also read me sometimes in Jacobin and some Canadian independent left media outlets like The Breach and Ricochet and The Maple. And my podcast, Big Shiny Takes and The Forgotten Corner, are available on your podcaster of choice. And I just wanted to thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of your work. It was great to be here.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
I really appreciate it.